Hi everyone, welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, like it is every week, and I'm here again with another story. Now this one's going to be another two-parter, so be prepared for there to be another video following this. But this story is really interesting to me because it comes in a few parts. There's a few chapters, kind of like the other story we had, the Snow Queen? Ice Queen? Snow Queen? Is that this one? They both have to do with queens and they're very long. Either way, I'm excited to get started. And I have tea because hot. I have tea because I'm going to need to lubricate my throat with honey and warm things because, again, it's going to be very long. I'm very excited. So let's get started. This week we are reading The Ice Maiden, Part 1. Chapter 1. Little Rudy. Let's pay a visit to Switzerland. Let's take a look around in the glorious mountain landscape where the forests grow on the steep rock faces. Let's climb up to the dazzling snowfields and then walk back to the green meadows where the rivers and streams rush along, as if afraid they might not reach the sea in time and disappear. The sun is blazing in the deep valley. It's blazing on the heavy snow masses high above, making them melt together over the years into gleaming blocks of ice to become cascading avalanches and towering glaciers. Two of them lie in the wide ravines beneath Schreckhorn and Winterhorn, near the little mountain village of Grindelwald. They are peculiar sights, and that's why, in the summer, many strangers come here from all countries around the world. They come over the high, snow-covered mountains, they come from below in the deep valleys. For hours they have to climb, and as they climb, the valley sinks farther behind. They look down into it as if they were peering from a balloon. Clouds often hover overhead like thick, heavy curtains of smoke around the mountain peaks, while down in the valley, where scores of brown wooden houses are scattered about, a ray of sun glitters, lighting up a pageant radiant green as if it were transparent. The water rushes, drones and roars below. The water trickles and murmurs above, looking like fluttering ribbons of silver along the rock face. On both sides of the road leading up to the slope stand half-timbered houses, each with its own little potato patch, which is a necessity since inside there are many mouths to feed. This place is brimming with children, and they have certainly big appetites. From all the houses they tumble out, crowding around the travelers, whether they arrive on foot or by coach. All the children are engaged in trade. The little ones offer for sale exquisitely carved wooden houses that look like the ones built in these mountains. Rain or shine, the swarms of children appear with their wares. 20-odd years ago, a little boy would stand here from time to time, but always slightly apart from the other children, wanting to sell something too. He stood with such a serious expression and with both hands holding tight to his splint wood box, as if he didn't want to part with it after all. But it was precisely because of this earnestness and the fact that the lad was so young that people noticed him. Yes, even singled him out. And he often made the best sales, though he couldn't have said why. Higher up the mountain lived his maternal grandfather, who carved the exquisite, splendid houses. And up there, in one room, stood an old cupboard filled with all kinds of carvings. There were nutcrackers, knives, forks, and boxes with lovely foliage and leaping chamois. Everything that might please a child's eye. But the little boy, whose name was Rudy, looked with greater desire and longing at the old rifle up by the rafters. His grandfather had said that one day it would be his, but first he had to grow strong and big enough to use it. Even though the boy was young, he was put in charge of watching the goats. If being able to clamber around with them was a sign of a good herder, then Rudy was a good herder. He climbed even a bit higher than they did because he was fond of looking for birds' nests up in the trees. He was daring and bold, but no one ever saw him smile except when he stood near the rushing waterfall or when he heard the rumble of an avalanche. He never played with the other children. He joined them only when his grandfather sent him down to sell his wares, and Rudy didn't care much for that. He preferred to scamper around on the slopes alone, or sit with his grandfather and listen to him talk about the old days and the people in nearby Meringen, where he was from. The people hadn't been there since the beginning of the world, he said, but had migrated there. They had come from far north, and that's where their ancestors lived, known as the Swedes. It took great wisdom to learn this, and Rudy had learned it, but he gained even more wisdom from spending time with the other occupants of the house, those belonging to the race of animals. They had a big dog named Ajola, that Rudy had inherited from his father, and they had a tomcat. It was this cat in particular who came to mean a great deal to Rudy. The cat taught him how to climb. "Come onto the roof with me," the cat had said, quite clearly and intelligibly, because when you're a child and can't yet talk, you understand perfectly the hens and ducks and cats and dogs. They speak to us just as clearly as father and mother speak. You just have to be very young. Even grandfather's cane can whinny and turn into a horse with a head, legs, and tail. For some children, the ability to understand fades later than for others, and people who say they are slow and remain children for far too long, but people say so many things. "Come with me, little Rudy, onto the roof." That was one of the first things the cat said, and Rudy understood. "People just imagine that they're going to fall. You won't fall if you're not afraid. Come on, put one paw here and another over there. Feel your way with your front paws. Keep your eyes alert and your limbs nimble. If there's a gap, then jump over it and hold on tight. That's what I do." And that's what Rudy did too. That's why he sat so often up on the ridgepole with the cat. He also sat with him in the treetops and even sat high up on rocky precipices where the cat never went. "Higher, higher," said the trees and shrubs. "Do you see how high we climb? Look how high we reach, where we cling so tightly even to the tip of a narrow rock ledge." And Rudy would make his way up to the top of the mountain, often before the sun had reached it, and take his morning drink, the fresh, invigorating mountain air, the drink that only our Lord can prepare, although humans can read the recipe. It says, "Fresh fragrance of mountain herbs, mint from the valley, and thyme. Everything that is oppressive the hovering clouds absorb, and then the winds card them through the spruce forest like wool. The breath of fragrance turns to air, light and fresh, always fresher." That was Rudy's morning drink. The sunbeams, daughters of the sun, brought their blessings and kissed his cheek, while Vertigo stood nearby, lurking but not daring to approach. And the swallows from grandfather's house, never fewer than 7 nests, flew up to him, and the goats singing, "You and us and you!" They brought greetings from home, even from the 2 hens, the only birds allowed inside the house, though Rudy never spoke to them. In spite of his young age, he had traveled quite a bit, and over considerable distances for such a small lad. He was born in Canton Valais, and was carried over the mountains. Recently, he had gone on foot to visit nearby Staubach waterfall, which billows like a silver veil in the air before the snow-covered, dazzling white Jungfrau. And he had been to Grindelwald to see the great glacier, but that was a sad story. That was where his mother had met her death. "That's where all childish merriment was swept out of little Rudy," his grandfather said. "Before the child was a year old, he laughed more than he cried." His mother had written, but ever since he had landed in the ice crevasse, quite a different temperament had taken hold of him. Grandfather rarely spoke of this, but everyone in the mountain knew what had happened. Rudy's father, as we know, had been a mail coach driver. The big dog at home had always accompanied him on his route over the Simbelden Pass and down to Lake Geneva. Rudy's relatives on his father's side had lived in the valley of the Rhone and Canton Valais. His uncle was a skilled chamois hunter and a well-known guide. Rudy was only a year old when he lost his father, and his mother decided to take her little child home to her family in the Berner Oberland. Her father lived several hours' journey from Grindelwald. He was a wood carver and earned enough to live comfortably. In June she left, carrying her infant in the company of 2 chamois hunters, heading home across the Gemmi Pass to reach Grindelwald. Most of the journey was behind them when they came across the ridge to the snowfield and caught sight of the home valley, with its familiar wooden houses scattered about. All that remained was the difficult task of walking across the highest part of one of the great glaciers. The newly fallen snow hid a chasm, which did not reach down to the very bottom where the water roared, but it was still deeper than a man's height. The young woman, carrying her child, slipped, fell through, and was gone. No one heard the scream or a sigh, but they heard a little child crying. More than an hour passed before her two companions managed to bring ropes and poles from the nearest house below, hoping they might help. After great difficulty, they pulled from the icy crevasse two bodies, or so it seemed. Using every means possible, they succeeded in calling the child back to life, but not the mother. And so, the old grandfather received in his house not his daughter, but his daughter's son, the child who laughed more often than he cried, and though that habit now seemed to have been broken. The change no doubt occurred inside the glacier cleft, inside the strange cold world of ice where the souls of the condemned were locked inside until Judgment Day, as the Swiss believe. Not unlike a rushing stream, frozen and pressed into green blocks of glass, the glacier lies there, with one immense block of ice heaped on top of another. In the depths below, thunders of rolling current of melted snow and ice. Deep caves and mighty chasms tower inside. It's a wondrous glass palace, and inside lives the Ice Maiden, a glacier queen. She who kills and crushes, it's partly a child of the air, partly mighty ruler of the river. That's why she has the power to ascend with the speed of a chamois up to the very peak of the snowy mountain, where the most daring of mountain climbers have the chopped footholds in the ice. She sails on a slender spruce bow along the sweet speeding river, leaps from boulder to boulder, with her long snow-white hair flooding around her and her blue-green gown glistening like water in the deep Swiss lakes. "Crush! Hold tight! The power is mine!" she says. "A lovely boy they stole from me, a boy I had kissed, but not kissed to death. He is once again among the humans. He is herding goats on the mountain, clambering up, always upward away from the others, but not from me. He's mine, and I shall take him." As she told Vertigo to carry out her orders. In the summertime, it was too sultry for the Ice Maiden to go out in the open where the mint plants thrive. So Vertigo rose up and dove down. One appeared, then three. Vertigo had many sisters, a whole flock of them, and the Ice Maiden chose the strongest among them, who rule both indoors and out. They sit on banisters and on tower railings. They run like squirrels along mountain ledges, and they leap outdoors to tread air the way swimmers tread water, luring their victims out and down into the abyss. Vertigo and the Ice Maiden both seize hold of humans the way Polyp grabs everything that comes near. Vertigo would seize hold of Ruby. "You want me to grab him?" said Vertigo. "But I can't do it. The cat, that scoundrel, has taught the boy his tricks. That child has a special power that chases me away. I can't reach that little lad when he's hanging from a branch over the abyss. No matter how I'd like to tickle the soles of his feet or give him a shove into the air, I can't do it." "We can do it," said the Ice Maiden. "You or I. I. "No, no," they heard, as if the mountain were echoing the ringing of the church bells, but it was a song. It was a voice. It was a merging of the choir from the other spirits of nature, gentle, loving, and good, the Sunbeam's daughters. Each evening they settle down in a circle on the mountain peaks, spreading out in their rose-colored wings, which, as the sun sinks, blaze redder and redder, making the towering Alps glow. People call it alpenglow. Then, after the sun goes down, they retreat inside the summits into the white snow, sleeping there until the sun comes up, where they once again emerge. They especially love flowers, butterflies, and human beings, and little Rudy was their favorite. "You'll never catch him. You'll never keep him," they said. "Bigger and stronger ones I have caught and kept," said the Ice Queen. Then the daughters of the sun sang a song about the wanderer from whom the whirling wind tore his cloak and carried it off at a raging speed. The wind took the mortal husk, but not the man. "You children of force might seize him, but you can never hold him. He is stronger. He is more ethereal than we are. He climbs higher than our mother, the sun. He knows the secret word that binds the wind and water so they must serve and obey him. If you loosen the heavy, oppressive weight, he will rise up even higher." How lovely was the choir ringing like church bells. And every morning, and the ray of the sun shone through the one little window in Grandfather's house to reach the silent child, The Sunbeam's daughters wanted to thaw out, warm up, take away once and for all the ice kisses that the royal maiden of the glacier had given him when he lay in the arms of his dead mother inside the deep ice crevasse from which he was rescued, as if by a miracle. Chapter 2. Journey to the New Home. Rudy was now 8 years old. His uncle in the Rhone Valley on the other side of the mountains wanted the boy to come stay with him. There he could be given better training and have more of a future. His grandfather realized this and let him go. So Rudy would soon be leaving. There were many others besides his grandfather from whom he needed to take leave. First there was Ajola, the old dog. "Your father drove the mail coach and I was the mail coach dog," said Ajola. "We traveled up and down. I know all the dogs and people, even on the other side of the mountains. I've never been one to say much, but now that we don't have much longer to talk, I want to say a bit more than I usually do. I want to tell you a story that I've been brooding about for a long time. I don't understand it, and you won't either. But that doesn't matter, because it was taught me is that things aren't fairly divided up in the world, neither for dogs or for humans. Not everyone was born to lay upon a lap or slurp milk. It's not something I've ever been accustomed to. But I've seen a puppy riding along the mail coach, sitting where a person should sit. The lady who was his mistress, or for whom he was the master, had brought along a milk bottle and was feeding the puppy with it. She offered him a bread sprinkled with sugar, but he didn't even deign to eat it. He just sniffed at it, and then she ate it herself. I ran through the mud along the side of the coach, as a hungry dog can be, and I was chewing on my own thoughts. Things were not as they should be, but no doubt plenty of things are not. I hope you're allowed to ride inside a carriage and ride in luxury, but that's not something you can bring about on your own. I've never been able to do it, either by barking or baying." That was Ajola's speech, and Rudy threw his arms around the dog's neck and kissed him right on his wet snout. Then he picked up the cat, who tried to twist out of his grasp. "You're getting too strong for me, and I don't want to use my claws on you. Go ahead and clamber over the mountains. I taught you how to climb. Don't ever believe that if you're going to fall, and then you'll do just fine." Then the cat ran off because he didn't want Rudy to see the sorrow shining in his eyes. The hens scurried around on the floor. One of them had lost her tail. A traveler who wanted to be a hunter had shot off her tail because the man mistook her for a bird of prey. "Rudy is going over the mountains," said one of the hens. "He's always in a hurry," said the other, "and I don't like farewells." Then the both of them trotted off. He also said goodbye to the goats, and they shouted, "Bak, bak, ba!" And it was very sad. Among the people of the district, there were 2 clever guides who were about to set off over the mountains. They were heading down to the other side toward Gemmi Pass, and Rudy went along with them on foot. It was a difficult hike for such a young lad, but he was strong, and his courage never flagged. The swallows flew along a part of the way. "You and us and you," they sang. The path led over the tumbling Lutschein, which in scores of little streams rushed out of the back chasm of the Grindelwald Glacier. Drifting tree trunks and fallen boulders served as a bridge. Then they reached the alder thickets and started to ascend the mountain, close to the place where the glacier had broken up loose from the slope. They were walking on the glacier, across the blocks of ice and around them. Rudy had to crawl for a bit, then walk for a bit. His eyes were shining with sheer enjoyment, and he set down his ironclad mountaineering boots very firmly, as if he wanted to mark his passage. The black sediment that the mountain stream had poured over the glacier gave it a singed appearance, yet the blue-green glassy ice shone through. They had to go around little ponds rimmed by up-thrusts block of ice, and the detour they came past a great boulder teetering on the edge of a crevasse. The boulder lost its balance, toppled over, and tumbled down, its echo resounding far below from the deep, hollow passageways of the glacier. Upward, ever upward they went. The glacier loomed above, like a river, wildly towering ice masses squeezed between steep cliffs. For a moment, Rudy thought about what he had heard, that he and his mother had fallen into those once cold-breathing chasms. But such thoughts quickly passed. It merely seemed to him like one of the many stories he had heard. Occasionally, when the men thought the path was a bit too difficult for the little fellow to climb, they reached out their hands to him. But he was never tired, and on the slippery path he took as steady as a chamois. Sometimes they walked across rocky ground, then between rocks with no trace of moss, then among low spruce trees, only to emerge once more into the green pastures ever-changing, ever new. All around loomed the snow-capped peaks, the ones he, like every child there, knew by name: Jungfrau, Monk, and Eiger. Rudy had never before climbed so high, never before set on the spreading sea of snow. There it lay, with its motionless waves of snow, from which the wind had blown little tufts the way it blows foam from the swells of the sea. Glacier after glacier, holding each other by the hand, if you can say such a thing. Each is a glass palace for the Ice Maiden, whose power and intent is to capture and to bury. The sun blazed hot, and the snow was so dazzling as if strewn with pale blue sparkling glints of diamond. Countless insects, especially butterflies and bees, lay piled dead in the snow. They had ventured too high, and the wind had carried them until they breathed their last in the cold. Around Wetterhorn, a finely carded wisp of wool seemed to hover, a threatening cloud. It dropped lower, billowing with what it concealed inside: a fawn. Its power would be deadly when it broke loose. Impressions of the entire trek became unforgettably fixed in Rudy's memory, making camp for the night on the slope on the path down onward in the deep mountain clefts where the water, for a dizzyingly length of time, had sawed through the stone. An abandoned stone hut on the other side of the snowy sea provided shelter for the night. Here they found charcoal and spruce boughs. They soon lit a fire and made their beds for the night as best they could. The men sat around the fire, smoking tobacco and drinking the warm spiced drink that they had made for themselves. Rudy was given his share, and they talked about the mysterious creatures of the Alps, about the strange huge serpents in the deep lakes, about the night folk, the ghostly army that carried sleepers through the air and wondrous floating city of Venice, and about the wild herdsman who drove his black sheep across the pastures. Although they had never been seen, people had heard the sound of their bells and the flock's eerie bellowing. Rudy listened with curiosity, but no fear, which was something unknown to him. As he listened, he thought he sensed a ghostly, hollow roar. Yes, it grew more and more distinct. The men heard it too, stopped their talking, listened, and told Rudy that he must not fall asleep. It was the fawn blowing, that violent windstorm that hurls itself down from the mountains to the valley, and in its ferocity breaks trees as if they were reeds, shove half-timbered houses from one bank of the river to another, the way we move glass chess pieces on the board. An hour had passed, when they told Rudy that now it was over. Now he could go to sleep. Exhausted from the hike, he fell asleep as if on command. Early the next morning they departed. On that day, the sun lit up for Rudy new mountains, new glaciers, and snowfields. They had entered Canton-Valais, and were on the slope of the ridge that could be seen from Grindelwald, but still far from his new home. Other mountain clefts, other pastures, forests, and pathways appeared. Other houses, other people emerged. But who were those people he saw? How monstrous they looked, forbidding and obese, with sallow faces and necks of heavy, disgusting flesh that hung in great pouches. They were Cretans, miserably dragging themselves around and staring with dull eyes at strangers who had arrived. The women were the worst looking of all. Were these the people of his new home? Chapter 3. His Uncle. When Rudy reached his uncle's house, the people looked the way he was used to seeing them, thank the Lord. Only one cretin lived in there, a poor lad, one of those poor creatures who, in their poverty and desolation, have always been taken in by families in Canton-Valais, staying a few months at each home in turn. Poor Sapperly happened to be staying there when Rudy arrived. His uncle was a strong hunter, but he was also a skilled cooper. His wife was a small, lively woman with a face like a bird, eyes like an eagle, and a long neck covered with down. Everything was new for Rudy, like clothing, customs, even the language, but his child's ear would quickly learn to understand it. Everything looked so prosperous compared to his grandfather's home. The house they lived in was bigger, and the walls adorned with chamois horns and gleaming polished rifles. Above the door hung a painting of the Virgin Mary with fresh alpine roses and a glowing lamp standing in front. His uncle was known of the region's most skillful chamois hunters, as well as the best, most experienced guide. Rudy was now to be the house pet, although it's true they already had a pet, an old, blind, and deaf hunting dog who could no longer be of service, though once he had been. They remembered the animal's skill in earlier times, and that's why he was now a member of the family, living out his days in comfort. Rudy patted him, but the dog didn't care much for strangers, and Rudy was still a stranger, although not for long. He soon took root in their home and in their hearts. "Things aren't so bad here in Canton-Valais," said his uncle. "We have plenty of chamois, and they won't die out soon, like the alpine ibex. Things are much better now than in the old days. No matter how much the past is praised, the present is better. A hole has been punched in the bag and fresh air has come to our isolated valley. Something better always emerges when antiquated ways are discarded," he said, and when his uncle was in a talkative mood, he would tell about his childhood years, back when his father was in his prime, and Valais was a closed bag, as he called it, with far too many ill people and wretched cretins. "But the French soldiers came. They were the true doctors. They killed off both disease and the people. Those Frenchmen knew how to strike. They could strike in many ways, and the girls could strike too." And with that, his uncle nodded to his French-born wife and laughed. "The French people could strike rocks, so they gave way. They carved this simple pass out of the cliffs. They carved a road so that I can now say to a 3-year-old child, 'Walk down to Italy, just follow the highway,' and the child will find his way south to Italy as if he keeps to the highway." And then his uncle sang a French song and gave cheer for Napoleon Bonaparte. That was the first time Rudy had heard about France, about Lyon, the great city on the Rhone River, which his uncle had visited. It wouldn't take many years for Rudy to become a skilled chamois hunter. He had a talent for it, said his uncle, and he taught the boy to hold a rifle, aim, and fire it. During hunting season, he took Rudy along to the mountains, letting him drink from the warm chamois blood, which would cure a hunter of vertigo. He taught the boy to recognize the times when on various mountain slopes avalanches would roll, at noon or in the evening, all depending on how the sun cast its rays. He taught him to pay careful attention to the chamois and learn from their leaping so that he would land on his feet and stand firm. And if there was no foothold in the mountain cleft, then he would have to use his elbows for support, hold tight, using the muscles in his thighs and calves. Even the back of his neck could catch hold if necessary. The chamois were clever, sending out their scouts, but the hunter had to be even more clever, tracking them downwind. He could fool them by hanging his coat and hat on the alpenstock, and the chamois would mistake the coat for a man. Rudy's uncle tried this trick one day, and when they were out hunting together. The mountain path was narrow. In fact, there was very little left of it. Only a thin ledge close to the gaping abyss. The snow was partially thawed, and the rock crumbled when they stepped on it, so his uncle lay down, stretching out as far as he could, and crawled forward. Every stone that broke off would fall, strike and slope, bounce, and keep rolling, leaping from one rock to another before it came to rest in the black depths. 100 paces behind his uncle stood Rudy, on the very last solid heap of rock, and in the air he saw approaching, hovering over his uncle, a mighty bearded vulture, beating his wings, about to toss the creeping snake over the precipice and turning it into carrion. His uncle had eyes only for the chamois and its young kid that were visible across the chasm. Rudy fixed his eyes on the bird, understanding its intent, and that's why he put his hand on his rifle to shoot. Then the chamois set off running across the slope. His uncle fired, and the animal was struck by the lethal bullet, but its kid escaped, as if it had spent a lifetime fleeing from danger. The enormous bird of prey also sped away, frightened by the shot. His uncle never realized his peril, but heard it from Rudy. Now, as they headed home in the best of moods, his uncle whistled a tune from his youth, and they suddenly heard a strange sound not far away. They looked to both sides. They looked up, and there, at the top of a steep mountain ridge, the snow cover rose up, rippling the way a spreading piece of linen does when the wind rushes underneath. The waves of the crest broke, as if they were marble slabs bursting, and then set free in foaming, gushing water, booming like a muted peal of thunder. It was an avalanche that came crashing down, not on top of Rudy and his uncle, but close, much too close for them. "Hold on tight, Rudy!" he shouted. "Hold on with all your might!" And Rudy grabbed hold of the nearest tree trunk. His uncle climbed up into the branches of the tree above and held on tight as the avalanche rolled past, many yards away from them. But the draft of the wind and the gales in its wake broke and crushed trees and brushes all around as if they were dry reeds, and then tossed them aside. Rudy lay pressed to the ground. The tree trunk he had been clinging to looked as if it had been sawed in half, and the crown had been flung far away. There, among the shattered branches, lay his uncle, with his head smashed in. His hand was still warm, but his face was beyond recognition. Rudy stood there, pale and trembling. It was the first time he felt fear in his life, the first moment of terror he had ever known. Carrying his message of death, he returned late that evening to the home that was now a house of sorrow. His uncle's wife stood without uttering a word, without shedding a tear, and only when the body was brought did her grief give voice. The poor cretin crept into his bed and was not seen at all the next day. Toward the evening, he came to Rudy. "Write a letter for me. Saperli can't write. Saperli can take the letter to the post office." "A letter from you," said Rudy. "Who's it to?" "To Master Christ." "What do you mean by that?" The dim-witted lad, as they called the cretin, looked at Rudy with pitiful eyes, clapped his hands, and said in a somber and pious voice, "Jesus Christ, Saperli wants to send him a letter to beg him to let Saperli die instead of the master of this house." Rudy took Saperli into his hands. "That letter will never reach its destination. That letter won't bring him back." Rudy found it difficult to explain to him how impossible that was. "Now you're the sole support of this household," said his foster mother. And that's what Rudy became. Chapter 4. Babette. Who was the best shot in Canton Valais? Oh yes, the chamois knew. "Watch out for Rudy," they might say. "Who's the most handsome hunter?" "Why, Rudy is," said the girls, but they didn't say, "Watch out for Rudy." Not even their somber mothers said that, because he nodded just as politely to them as to the young girls. He was so lively and cheerful, his cheeks were tan, his teeth were fresh white, and his eyes shone coal-black. A handsome fellow he was, and only 20 years old. The icy water never bit his flesh when he swam. He could wriggle through the water like a fish, climb like no one else, cling to the rock face like a snail. Strong muscles and sinews he possessed. He was also apparent in that way as he left. The cat was the first to teach him how, and later the chamois. The best guide to entrust yourself to was Rudy. He could have made a fortune doing that. He had no thoughts for the cooper trade, which his uncle had also taught him. His sole desire was to shoot chamois, and that's what brought in the money. Rudy was a good match, as they said, if only he wouldn't look beyond his social station. As a dancer, he was what girls dreamed of, and a few of them walked around, wide awake, thinking about him. "He kissed me at the dance," said the schoolmaster's Annette to her dearest friend, "but she shouldn't have mentioned it, even to her dearest friend." That sort of news is hard to keep a secret, like sand in a bag full of holes. It runs out. Soon, no matter how proper and respectable Rudy might be, everyone knew he had kissed girls at the dances, and yet he never kissed the one he wanted most to kiss. "He's no fool," said an old hunter. "He kissed Annette. It started with an A, and will probably kiss his way through the whole alphabet." One kiss at a dance was all the gossips could say about Rudy so far, but he did kiss Annette, and yet she was not the least the true flower of his heart. Down near Bex, among the great walnut trees close to a small rushing mountain stream, lived a wealthy miller. His residence was a large, 3-story building with little towers covered with wooden shingles and trimmed with tin plate that gleamed in the sunshine and moonlight. Atop the largest tower was a weather vane with a glittering arrow piercing an apple in it. that was supposed to signify Wilhelm Tell's arrow shot. The mill looked both prosperous and elegant, easily sketched or described in writing, but the miller's daughter was not so easily sketched or described. At least that's what Rudy would have said. Yet he stood, etched in his heart, where her eyes shone bright enough to start a fire. The blaze had appeared suddenly, just as fires do, and the strangest thing was that the miller's daughter, the charming Babette, was unaware of it. She and Rudy had never spoken so much as 2 words to each other. The miller was rich, and his wealth meant that Babette's social standing was quite high. But nothing is so high, said Rudy to himself, that can't be reached. You simply have to climb, and you won't fall if you believe that you won't. That was the rule he had learned at home. Now, it so happened that Rudy had business in Bex and took quite a journey to get there. The railroad had not yet come to those parts. From the Rhone glacier, along the base of the Cymbeline Range, between scores of shifting mountain ridges stretched the wide valley of the Valais with its mighty Rhone River, which often overflows and floods into the fields and roads, destroying everything. Between the towns of Sion and St. Maurice, the valley curves, bending like an elbow, becoming so narrow below St. Maurice that there is only room for riverbed and a narrow lane. Canton Valais ends here, and old towers stand sentry perched on the slope, looking out across the stone bridges to the toll booth on the other side, where Canton Vaud begins. Not far from there is the nearest town of Bex. Along the way, with each step forward, everything swells with richness and abundance, as if you were in a grove of chestnut and walnut trees. Here and there, cypresses and pomegranate blossoms peer out. There is a southern warmth, as if you'd come to Italy. Rudy reached Bex, took care of his business, and had a look around, but not a single worker did he see from the mill, let alone Babette. Things were not as he had wished. Everything came, and the air was filled with a fragrance from the wild thyme and the flowering lindens. A glittering sky-blue veil seemed to hover over the forest-green mountains. Silence enveloped them, and it was not the silence of sleep nor death. No, it was as if all nature were holding its breath, standing still so its photograph could be taken against the backdrop of the blue sky. Here and there among the trees and across the green fields stood poles holding the telegraph wires that stretched along the quiet valley. Leaning against one of these poles was a figure so motionless that you might think it was a dead tree trunk. But it was Rudy who stood there, as silent as everything else around him at that moment. He was not asleep, nor was he dead. But just as the great events of the world had so often fly through the telegraph wires, moments in life that are important to some individual, although no sign of this indicated by the slightest trembling or sound from the wires, so did there pass through Rudy's mind, as if life's happiness, mighty, overwhelming, his constant thought from that moment on. His eyes were fixed on one spot among the leaves, a light from the parlor in the miller's house, where Babette lived. Rudy stood there, so quietly that you might think he was aiming at a chamois, but at that moment he was himself like a chamois, who for minutes at a time can stand as if chiseled out of the mountain. Then suddenly, at the sound of a stone rolling, it makes a leap and races off. And that's precisely what Rudy did. A thought rolled. "Never give up," he said. "Pay a visit to the mill. Say good evening to the miller, good evening to Babette. You won't fall if you believe you won't. Babette must have a good look at me sooner or later if I'm to be her husband." And Rudy laughed and headed to the mill in good spirits. He knew what he wanted. He wanted Babette. And the river, with its pale yellow water, roared past. The windows and linden trees leaned over the rushing water. Rudy walked along the path, and as it says in the old children's song, there was no one at home at the miller's house but a little cat and a little mouse. The parlor cat stood on the steps, arching her back, and said, "Meow." But Rudy paid no attention to what she was saying. He knocked. No one heard him. No one opened the door. "Meow," said the cat. If Rudy had been younger, he would have understood the cat's language and heard her say, "Nobody's home." And it was that he had to go over to the mill to inquire. There he learned that the master of the house was traveling. He had gone far away to the city of Interlacus, meaning between the lakes, as a schoolmaster, Annette's father, in his wisdom had explained. There, far away, was the miller and Babette too. A great shooting competition would begin the next day and last for a whole week. Swiss from all the German cantons were in attendance. Poor Rudy, you might say. This was not the most fortunate time for him to come to Bex. He might as well go back home, and he did, taking the road via St. Maurice and Sion, back to his own valley, his own mountains. But he was not downhearted. By the time the sun came up the next morning, his spirits had been up for a long time. In fact, they had never been down. Babette is in Interlaken, many days' journey from here, he said to himself. It's a long trek if you take the regular highway, but it's not very far if you head across the mountains, and that's the route for a chamois hunter to take. I've taken that path before. That's where my home district lies, where I lived with my grandfather as a child, and they're having a shooting competition in Interlaken. I'll be the winner there, and I'll also win Babette as soon as I make her acquaintance. With a light knapsack to carry his Sunday clothes, his rifle, and his hunter's bag, Rudy set up off the mountain, taking the short route, which was still long enough, but the shooting match had only just begun that day and would last through the week. They had told him that during that time the miller and Babette would be staying in their relatives in Interlaken. Rudy headed across the Gemmi Pass. He wanted to go by the way of Grindelwald. Briskly and joyously, he strode along, heading upward in the fresh, light, invigorating mountain air. The valley dropped farther behind. His field of vision expanded. Here, a snowy peak. There, a snowy peak. And soon, the gleaming white of the Alpine range. Rudy knew each snow-capped mountain. He headed towards Schreckhorn, which thrust its white powdered stone fire in the blue air. Finally, he crossed the ridge, and the pasture sloped down towards his home valley. The air was light, and his spirit was light too. The mountains and the valley were covered with flowers and greenery, and his heart was brimming with the youthful thought, I will never grow old, I will never die. Live, prevail, enjoy. Free as a bird, light as a bird was he. And the swallows flew past, singing as they had in his childhood, You and us and you! Everything was soaring and joyous. Below lay the velvet green meadow scattered with brown wooden houses. The Lutschein River thundered and roared. He saw the glacier with its glass-green edges in the grimy snow and its deep fissures. He saw both the upper and lower glacier. The ringing bells in the church reached out to him, as if they wanted to chime in a welcome home. His heart beat faster, swelling so much that for a moment Babette vanished from inside it. So did his heart grow so big, so filled with memories. Once again, he walked along the road where, as a little boy, he had stood with the other children in the ditch, selling carved wooden houses. Up there, beyond the spruce trees, his grandfather's house still stood. Strangers lived there now. Children came running along the road, wanting to sell him something. One of them held out an alpine rose. Rudy took it as a good sign and thought of Babette. Soon he crossed the bridge where the two forks of the Lutschein merge. More leafy trees grew there, the walnut trees giving shade. Now he could see flags waving. The white cross on the red background found both on Swiss and Danish flags, and before him lay Interlaken. It was certainly a magnificent city, like no other, thought Rudy. A Swiss city dressed in its Sunday best. It was not like the other provincial towns with a crowd of massive stone buildings, ponderous, foreign-looking, and imposing. No, here it looked as if the wooden houses from up on the slopes had come running down into the green valley next a clear, swiftly moving river and lined up in a row, a bit unevenly, to form a street. And the most splendid street of all, well, it had certainly sprung up since Rudy was last here as a child. It seemed to have been created with all of its charming wooden houses that his grandfather had carved, and that filled up the covert back home, had taken up position and grown in size. Just like the old, most ancient of chestnut trees. Every building was a hotel, as they were called, with carved wooden trim around the windows and balconies and their roofs jutting out, so decorative and dainty. And in the front of each building was a complete flower garden stretching out to the wide paved road. Along the road stood the buildings, but only on one side. Otherwise, they would have hidden the fresh green meadow on the other side where the cows ambled with their bells ringing as they did in the alpine pastures. The meadow was surrounded by tall mountains, which seemed to part right down the middle if you had a good view of the gleaming snow-capped peaks of Jungfrau, the loveliest of all the Swiss mountains. What a throng of festively dressed gentlemen and ladies from foreign lands! What a swarm of country people from the various cantons! Marksmen wore on their hats little rosettes with the number of their position in the shooting match. There was music and singing, barrel organs and wind instruments, shouting and commotion. The buildings and bridges were decorated with verses and emblems, flags and banners fluttered, and rifles fired, shot after shot. That was the best music to Rudy's ears, making him completely forget about Babette, who was the reason he had come. The marksmen made their way to target practice. Rudy quickly joined them, and he was the most skilled, the happiest of all. Each of the time he shot, he hit the bull's-eye. Who is this stranger, this very young hunter? People asked. He speaks French the way it's spoken in Canton Valais, but he can also make himself understood quite well in our German language, said others. As a child, he lived here in the region, near Grindelwald, one of them explained. He was a spirited fellow. His eyes shone, his gaze and arm were steady. That's why he hit his mark. Joy prompts courage, and courage is what Rudy always possessed. Quickly, he attracted a whole circle of friends around him. He was hailed and praised, and Babette had nearly vanished from his thoughts. Then a heavy hand fell on his shoulder, and a rough voice addressed him in French. "You're from Canton Valais?" Rudy turned around and saw a ruddy, pleased face, a stout man. It was the rich miller from Bex. Hidden in his portly body was the delicate, dainty Babette, who soon peeked out those sparkling dark eyes of hers. The rich miller was making much of the fact that a hunter from Canton was taking the best shots and winning acclaim. Rudy was certainly a child of fortune. What he had come to find was but here had nearly forgotten, and now found him instead. When you're far from home and meet people from your own district, you behave as old friends. You talk to each other. At the shooting competition, Rudy was the best shot, just as the miller back home in Bex was the best with his money and his fine mill. And so the two men shook hands, something they'd never done before. Babette, too, clasped Rudy's hand sincerely, and he clasped hers in return and looked at her. He looked at her so she flushed bright red. The miller spoke of the long route that had brought them there, the many great cities they had seen. It had been a proper journey. They had sailed by lake steamer and traveled by rail and by coach. "I took a shorter route," said Rudy. "I came over the mountains. No path is so high it can't be traveled." "But you could also break your neck," said the miller. "And you look like the sort who will break your neck one day, as daring as you are." "You won't fall if you believe that you won't," said Rudy. And the miller's relatives in Interlaken, with whom the miller and Babette were staying, invited Rudy to visit them since he was from the same canton as their family. That was the welcome invitation for Rudy. Fortune was with him. It always is on the person who believes in himself and remembers that. Our Lord may provide the nuts, but he does not crack them open. Rudy was treated like one of the family by the miller's relatives, and they drank a toast to the best marksman. Babette clinked glasses too, and Rudy thanked them for the toast. Toward the evening, they strolled along the beautiful road past the festive-looking hotels beneath the old walnut trees. There was such a crowd, such jostling that Rudy had to offer Babette his arm. He was so happy that he had met people from Vaud, he said. Vaud and Valais were good neighbors. He expressed his joy with such fervor that Babette felt compelled to clasp his hand. They walked along almost like old friends, and she was so amusing, that petite, charming girl. It was quite enchanting, thought Rudy, the way she could point out that it was ridiculous and affected about the way the foreign ladies were dressed and the way they walked, though she didn't mean to make fun of them, because they might very well be quite respectable people. Oh yes, Babette knew all about that, since she had a godmother who was such an elegant English lady. 18 years ago, when Babette was baptized, she had come to Bex. She had given Babette the precious brooch that she wore on her bodice. Twice her grandmother had sent a letter, and this year she was supposed to meet Babette here in Interlaken along with her daughters, who were old maids, close to 30, said Babette. She herself was only 18. Her sweet little lips never paused even for a moment, and everything Babette said sounded to Rudy's ears as if it were the utmost importance. He told her in turn whatever he could think of to tell, how often he had been to Beck's, how well he knew the mill, how often he had seen Babette, though she probably had never noticed him. And when he last paid a visit to the mill, his head was filled with thoughts that he could not mention, and she and her father were gone far away. But the distance didn't stop him from clambering over the barrier that made the road so long. Yes, that much he did say, along with a great many other things. He told her how fond he was of her, and that it was for her sake and not because of the shooting competition that he had come. Babette fell silent. It was almost too much, all that he confessed to her all at once. And as they walked, the sun sank behind the towering wall of mountains. The young Frau stood there in all its splendor and glory, surrounded by the forest green wreath of the nearby slopes. The whole crowd stood still and looked in that direction. Rudy and Babette also gazed at the magnificent. "Nowhere lovelier than here," said Babette. "Nowhere," said Rudy, looking at Babette. "Tomorrow I must leave," he said after a moment. "Come visit us in Beck's," whispered Babette. "It would please my father." Chapter 5. The Journey Home. Oh, how much Rudy had to carry when he headed home across the mountains on the following day. Yes, he had 3 silver cups, 2 excellent rifles, and a coffee pot made of silver, which he could put to good use when he had a home of his own. Yet this was not the most important thing. There was something much more important, more powerful that he carried, or rather that carried him home on the high mountains. But the weather was raw, gray, and dreary. The clouds were draped like funeral crepe over the heights, shrouding the gleaming mountain peaks. From the forest floor rang the last blows of the axe, and down the slope rolled the tree trunks, looking like kindling from above. But close up they were trees as heavy as masts. The Luftshine roared its monotonous tone, and the wind howled, the clouds sailed by. Suddenly, a young girl was walking beside Rudy. He hadn't noticed her until she was quite close. She too was headed over the mountain. Her eyes had a peculiar power, compelling him to look into them. They were so strangely crystal clear, so deep and fathomless. "Do you have a sweetheart?" asked Rudy. All his thoughts were filled with having a sweetheart. "No, I do not," she said, and laughed. But it sounded as if she were lying. "Let's not take the long way around," she went on. "We should head more to the left. It's shorter." "Yes, if you want to fall into a crevasse," said Rudy. "You should know the way better if you're going to be a guide." "But I do know the way," she said, "and I have my wits about me. Yours are down there in the valley. Up here, you have to think about the Ice Maiden. She's not kind to human beings, they say." "I'm not afraid of her," said Rudy. "She was forced to let me go when I was a child. I'm sure I can escape her now that I've grown up." And it grew darker. Rain fell. Snow came, glittering, blinding. "Give me your hand and I'll help you climb," said the girl, and she touched him with ice-cold fingers. "You help me?" said Rudy. "I don't yet need help of a girl to climb." And he walked faster away from her. The blizzard closed around him like a curtain. The wind whistled, and behind him he heard the girl laughing and singing. It sounded very strange. She must be some kind of troll in the service of the Ice Maiden. Rudy had heard about such things when he was a child, and spent the night up here on his trek through the mountains. The snowfall eased up, and the clouds lay beneath him. He looked back. There was no one in sight, but he heard laughter and yodeling, and it didn't sound as if they came from a human being. When Rudy finally reached the mountaintop where the path headed towards the valley of the Rhone, he saw the clear blue strip of sky towards the chamois, 2 gleaming stars. They were sparkling so brightly, and he thought about Babette. about himself and his good fortune, and the thoughts warmed his heart. Chapter 6. 6? 6. The visit to the mill. "What grand trophies you brought home!" said Rudy's old foster mother, and her strange eagle eyes flashed as she moved her scrawny neck even faster in odd twisting circles. "Good fortune is with you, Rudy. Let me kiss you, my dear boy." And Rudy allowed her to kiss him, but his face showed that he was merely tolerating the situation, all these minor household ordeals. "How handsome you are, Rudy," said the old woman. "Don't try to flatter me," said Rudy, and laughed, but he was pleased. "I'll say it again," said the old woman. "Good fortune is with you." "Yes, that much I do believe," he said, thinking of Babette. Never before had he longed as he did now for the deep valley. "They must have come home by now," he said to himself. "It's already 2 days past the time, and they plan to return. I have to go to Beck's." So Rudy went to Beck's, and the miller and his daughter were home. He was so warmly welcomed, and they brought him greetings from their family in Interlaken. Babette said very little. She had grown so silent. But her eyes spoke. That was quite enough for Rudy. The miller usually liked to do the talking. He was used to having people laugh at his jests and puns, since he was the rich miller after all. But he seemed to prefer listening to Rudy tell hunting tales about the hardships and dangers that the chamois hunters encountered on the high mountain summits, how they had to crawl their way along the unstable rocky cornices that were plastered to the slopes by wind and storms, how they crawled over the precarious bridges and the snowstorms dumped across the deep ravines. Rudy looked so lively that his eyes shone as he talked about the hunter's life, about the clever chamois and their daring leaps, about the mighty foam and the rumbling avalanches. He was quite aware that with each new description he was winning over the miller more and more, and that what especially appealed to the man was his account of the bearded vulture and the bold golden eagles. Not far from there, in Canton Valais, there was an eagle's nest, ingeniously built under an overhanging mountain ledge. There was an eaglet in the nest, but it was impossible to reach. Only a few days ago, an Englishman had offered Rudy a whole fistful of gold if he would bring back the bird alive. "But there's a limit to everything," he said. "That eaglet is impossible to reach, and it would be madness to even try." And the wine flowed, and the words flowed with it. But the evening was much too short, thought Rudy, and yet it was past midnight when he ended his first visit at the mill. The lights glittered a little while longer from the window and through the green boughs. Out of the open hatch and the roof came the parlor cat, and along the eaves came the kitchen cat. "Is there any news from the mill?" said the parlor cat. "Here in the house, a secret engagement has taken place. The father doesn't yet know about it. Rudy and Babette have been stepping on each other's paws all evening under the table. They stepped on me twice, but I didn't meow because it would have attracted attention." "Well, I would have meowed," said the kitchen cat. "What's proper in the kitchen is not proper in the parlor," said the parlor cat. "I wonder what the miller would say when he hears about this engagement." Yes, what would the miller say? Rudy wondered the same thing, and he couldn't wait long to find out. And so only a few days later, when the omnibus rumbled across the Rhone bridge between Valais and Vaud, Rudy was seated inside, in good spirits as usual, thinking lovely thoughts about hearing a yes that very evening. And when evening arrived, and the omnibus headed back the other direction, Rudy was once again inside, going the same way back. While at the mill, the parlor cat scurried to tell the news. "You from the kitchen, have you heard? The miller now knows everything. It's all come to a fine end. Rudy arrived here toward evening, and he and Babette had a great deal to whisper about. They were standing in the corridor just outside the miller's room. I lay at their feet, but they had neither eyes or thoughts for me." "I'll go right to tell your father," said Rudy. "My purpose is honorable." "Should I go with you?" asked Babette. "It might give you courage." "Oh, I have plenty of courage," said Rudy. "But if you come along, he'll have to be kind whether he wants to or not." And they went inside. "Rudy stepped so hard on my tail. Rudy's always so clumsy. I meowed, but neither he nor Babette had ears for me. They opened the door and went in together, with me leading the way. But I jumped onto the back of the chair. I couldn't predict whether Rudy might start kicking, but the miller was the one who kicked. And it was a good kick. Out the door, up the mountain to the chamois. That's what Rudy can now aim for, and not our little Babette." But what did they say? Asked the kitchen cat. Say? They said all those things that are said when proposing. I love her, she loves me, and if there's milk in the basin for one, there's enough milk in the basin for two. But her social But her social standing is too high for you, said the miller. She sits on grain and golden grain, as you know. You can never reach her. Nothing sits too high. I can reach if I want to, said Rudy, because he's a spirited fellow. But you said the last time that you could never reach the eaglet. Babette sits even higher. I'll take them both, said Rudy. All right. I'll give her to you when you can bring me the eaglet alive, said the miller, and laughed so hard that tears rolled down his face. But thank you for visiting us, Rudy. If you come back tomorrow, there won't be anyone home. Farewell. And Babette said farewell too, as pitifully as a little kitten who can't find her mother. A promise is a promise, a man, said Rudy. Don't cry, Babette. I'll bring back the eaglet. I hope you break your neck, said the miller. Then we'll be spared all your visiting. That's what I call a good kick. Now Rudy's gone off. And Babette is sitting here crying, but the miller is singing a song in German. He learned it on their travels, but I'm not going to worry about it. That won't help matters. But it would look good if you did, said the kitchen cat. Chapter 7. The Eagle's Nest. From the mountain path sounded a yodel, so merry and loud, heralding good spirits and undaunted courage. It was Rudy. He was going to see his friend Vesenad. You must help me. We can't take Ragley along. I'll have to capture the eagle up on the mountain ledge. How about capturing the dark side of the moon first? That's probably just as easy, said Vesenand. You're certainly in good spirits. Yes, because I'm thinking about getting married. But in all seriousness, listen here. I need to tell you how matters stand with me. And soon Vesenand and Ragley learned what Rudy intended. You're a daring lad, they said. But it's impossible. You'll break your neck. You won't fall if you won't think you won't, said Rudy. At midnight they departed, carrying poles, ladders, and ropes. The path had led through the thickets and shrubbery across scree and upward, even upward in the dark night. Water roared below. Water trickled from above. Sodden clouds drifted across the sky. The hunters reached the steep rock ledge. It grew darker there. The mountain walls were almost met, and only high overhead in the narrow gap did the sky brighten. Close by, and below them, was a deep abyss with rushing water. All three of them sat still. They wanted to wait for daybreak when the eagle flew out. It had to be shot before they could even think about capturing the eaglet. Rudy squatted down, as motionless as if he were part of the rock where he was perched. He held his rifle out, ready to shoot. His eyes were fixed on the uppermost cliff where the eagle's nest was hidden under a projecting ledge. 3 hunters waited a long time. Then high overhead they heard a crackling, whistling sound. A huge, hovering object deafened the dark sky. 2 guns' barrels took aim as a black eagle shape threw out of its nest. A shot rang out. For a moment, the outspread wings moved, and then the bird slowly dropped, as if with its size and wingspan it might fill the whole ravine, and its fall carry the hunters down with it. The eagle sank into the depths. Tree branches groaned, and shrubs broke under the bird's fall. Then they got busy. 3 of the longest ladders were tied together to reach all the way up. They were set on the farthest foothold of the edge toward the ravine, but they didn't quite reach. And the cliff face stretched smooth as a wall and a bit higher, where the nest was hidden in the shelter of the projecting rock. After some discussion, they agreed that there was no choice but to lower down into the ravine 2 ladders tied together, and then attach them to the 3 others that were already laid in place below. With great difficulty, they dragged the 2 ladders up to the top and tied the ropes tight. The ladders were shoved out over the projecting ledge and hung there, swinging freely over the abyss. Rudy was already sitting on the lowest rung. It was an ice-cold morning. Clouds of fog were rising up from the black chasm. Rudy was sitting there, like a fly perched on a swaying piece of straw that a nest-building bird had dropped on the edge of a tall factory chimney. But a fly can soar off if the straw comes loose. Rudy could only break his neck. The wind whistled around him, and down in the abyss racing water roared from the thawing glacier in the Ice Maiden's palace. Now, he started the ladder swinging, like a spider trying to grab hold from its long swaying thread. On the fourth try, when Rudy touched the tip of the ladders that were tied together and positioned below, he got hold of them and fastened them all together with a strong and steady hand, although they continued to wobble as if on worn hinges. The 5 long ladders looked like a swaying reed reaching up towards the nest, leaning vertically against the rock face. Now came the most dangerous part, which required climbing like a cat climbs. But that was something Rudy could do. The cat had taught him how. He didn't notice Vertigo, who strode through the air behind him, stretching out her paw-up arms towards him. Now Rudy was standing on top of the rung of the ladder, realized that even at his height he was not high enough to see into the nest. Only by using his hands could he reach it. He touched the thick intertwining branches on the bottom of the nest to see how sturdy they were, and when he had found a thick and solid branch, he swung himself from the ladder toward the branch and raised his head and chest over the side of the nest. Streaming towards him came a suffocating stench of carrion. Rotting lambs, chamois, and birds lay there ripped to shreds. Vertigo, who was powerless to touch Rudy, blew her poisonous vapors into his face, trying to daze him. And now, below in the gaping black depths on the racing water, sat the Ice Maiden herself, with her long, pale green hair staring with deadly eyes like the barrel of a shotgun. "Now I'm going to get you!" In a corner of the eagle's nest, Rudy saw a big, powerful eaglet that could not yet fly. He fixed his eyes on the bird, held on tight with one hand, and with the other flung a snare around the young eagle. It was captured alive, its legs caught in the tightening cord. Rudy tossed the snare, holding the bird over his shoulder, making sure that the bird hung well below him, as, with the help of a dangling rope, he held on to the tip of his foot, once again reached out the top rung of his ladder. "Hold on! If you don't believe you're going to fall, you won't!" It was the old rule which he followed, holding on tight as he crawled, certain that he would not fall. And he didn't. Now came the sound of a yodel, so loud and joyous. Rudy was standing on solid ground with the eaglet. And that is where we're going to end part 1 of the Ice Maiden. That was absolutely fascinating. I loved that so much. I really do love these longer stories because they take another level of storytelling. They involve you so deeply into the world. We're watching this boy grow up his entire life, his entire journey, and we're finally reaching the peak of his life. And you get to do that the longer you take with stories, the more details that you give, and I love that. I hope that this story ends on a good note and the Ice Maiden does not get Rudy. But I don't know. I guess we're going to have to find out. Alright. I have to drink this tea to calm my throat because reading for so long really does get to you sometimes. But anyway, thank you for joining me for another story time with Sid. I'm so excited to see what happens next week, and I hope you'll join me for the Ice Maiden part 2. And I hope you're staying happy, healthy, and safe. Have a great rest of your day.